Close your eyes. Can you feel the nauseating pitch and roll, the stench of rotting cabbage mingled with the acrid reek of coal dust seeping into your very pores? You are entombed deep within the bowels of the colossal battleship Suvorov, its steel hull baking at over 60 degrees Celsius as it crosses the equator. You are no glorious warrior, nor a dignified officer. You are nothing but a wretched Russian stoker. Day in and day out, you shovel tons of coal into the roaring maws of the steam engine. You pass out from heat stroke, get dragged out and doused with a bucket of freezing seawater to regain consciousness, only to be shoved right back into the furnace room, rewarded with nothing but brutal lashes from the officers above. You have endured this senseless, hellish labor for 8 agonizing months. You have been adrift at sea for exactly 33,000 kilometers, a distance equivalent to traversing nearly the entire circumference of the globe. The ship's proud paintwork has long since peeled away, leaving rust to devour every plate of metal. The hull beneath you is so heavily fouled with barnacles and seaweed that this 10,000-ton behemoth crawls across the water as sluggishly as a crippled old bear. The rations are rancid, fresh water is depleted, and scurvy and malaria run rampant, claiming the lives of dozens every week. But the worst part is not the tropical diseases or the blistering heat. The worst part is that you have drained the very last ounce of your vitality to drag this gargantuan machine halfway across the earth, not to achieve victory, but to sail straight into a prearranged slaughterhouse. Welcome back to Time Capsule. Today, we plunge into the frigid waters of the Tsushima Strait in 1905 to dissect one of the most horrifying, humiliating, and monumental mechanical clashes of the 20th century. But before we hear the roar of the 12-inch guns, we must answer one fundamental question. What on earth compelled a massive European fleet to embark on a mad dash all the way to Asia, only to deliver themselves to their own execution? In the early 1900s, the Russian Empire was a colossal leviathan of the Western world, thirsting to expand its territory and sphere of influence eastward, specifically seeking control over Manchuria and the Korean peninsula. But they unexpectedly slammed into a wall of steel, the Empire of Japan, an Asian nation rising with explosive momentum following the Meiji Restoration, boasting state-of-the-art military engineering procured directly from Great Britain. In 1904, the Russo-Japanese War erupted. Japan executed a textbook preemptive strike. Utilizing torpedo boats in a surprise night attack, they effectively bottled up the entire Russian Pacific Fleet at Port Arthur. Infuriated by the audacity of this small Asian nation, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia made what could be considered the most delusional decision in naval history. He ordered the Baltic Fleet, the pride of the Russian Navy, anchored halfway across the world in Europe, to weigh anchor and cross the oceans to Asia to relieve the besieged Pacific Fleet. Why not take the much shorter route through the Suez Canal? Because Great Britain, an ally of Japan, exerted suffocating diplomatic and strategic pressure on the Suez route, forcing Russia's main massive battleship armada to take the longest, most grueling path imaginable, circumnavigating the entire African continent. This turned the voyage into the worst logistical nightmare in history. To avoid running out of energy in the vastness of the ocean, Russian sailors had to stockpile coal in every conceivable corner, on the decks, in the corridors, and even inside the officers' quarters. The dense black coal dust infiltrated men's lungs, jammed sensitive mechanical gears, and reduced these majestic vessels to floating garbage scows. But the mechanical inadequacies were only half the story. The psychological state of the Russian sailors had fractured long before they even laid eyes on the Japanese. The moment they entered the North Sea, the Russian fleet succumbed to mass paranoia. The most glaring example was the Dogger Bank incident. Shrouded in the night's fog, the Russian sailors panicked to such an extent that they mistook tiny, wooden British fishing trawlers for stealthy Japanese torpedo boats, despite being tens of thousands of kilometers away from Japan. They fired frantically upon innocent fishermen, even shelling their own comrade ships in the chaotic darkness. That blunder nearly provoked the British Empire into an immediate declaration of war against Russia. It proved a grim reality. The men confined within those metal husks had lost their minds long ago. Then, as the Baltic Fleet limped into the Indian Ocean, they received devastating news. Port Arthur had fallen. The Pacific Fleet had been entirely annihilated by the Japanese. There was no one left to rescue. At this juncture, the Russian commanding officer, Admiral Zinovy Rozhestvensky, found himself backed into an absolute corner. Russia's only remaining safe harbor in Asia was Vladivostok, located far to the north. Glancing at the map, the Russian fleet had two options to reach it. One was to take the long route around the open Pacific to bypass Japan. But this distance was too vast, the seas were treacherous, and their ships had exhausted their very last lumps of coal. The second option was the shortest, most direct route, cutting straight through the narrow Tsushima Strait situated between Korea and Japan. But the Tsushima Strait was the home turf, the fatal gateway of the Japanese Navy. Rozhestvensky was fully aware that if he passed through there, he would face the entirety of the Japanese combined fleet. Yet, a machine without energy cannot run. He was forced to gamble with the Grim Reaper. He chose Tsushima. As the colossal, dilapidated Russian fleet dragged itself into the strait, the warships had carefully extinguished all lights, successfully navigating through the fog. They harbored the naive illusion that they could slip through unnoticed. However, they were exposed by the most absurd and tragically comic mechanical errors in history. The hospital ship accompanying the fleet, the Oriole, strictly adhering to international law in a rigid, mechanical fashion, had left its brilliant lights on. The Japanese scout cruiser Shinano Maru spotted that blinding glare amidst the dark sea. Instantly, the state-of-the-art Japanese wireless telegraphs, radios on board, began chirping their deadly beeps. Yes, this was the first naval battle in history decided by radio waves. Japan knew their exact coordinates. Commanding the Japanese combined fleet was the legendary Admiral Tōgō Heihachirō. The force at his disposal was a study in absolute contrast. The Japanese war machines had just left dry dock, scraped clean of every layer of fouling barnacles. Their turbine engines were smoothly lubricated. They were flawlessly tuned killing machines, capable of reaching speeds up to 16 knots. And the Russian ships. Aside from being dragged down by marine growth that reduced their maximum crawling speed to a mere 14 knots, they suffered from a fatal physical flaw. Due to the excessive overload of reserve coal, the weight of the Russian vessels far exceeded their design specifications. This caused the main armor belt, the thickest band of steel meant to sit exactly at the waterline to deflect artillery shells, to be submerged deep underwater. The hull exposed above the surface was merely thinly plated steel. In naval warfare, being 2 knots slower than your enemy while exposing your thinnest armor is enough to seal your death warrant. In the early afternoon of May 27th, the sky over Tsushima was a grim gray, the sea churning violently. Admiral Tōgō spotted the two massive columns of thick black smoke rising from the Russian fleet. Audiences often favor generals who sit safely in air-conditioned bunkers, issuing commands via radio, but not Tōgō. As the battle commenced, Tōgō refused to step into the conning tower, the thickest, safest steel box on the flagship Mikasa. Instead, he stepped out, exposing himself completely on the open compass bridge, utterly devoid of any armor protection. Moments later, as the thunderous Russian barrage struck, a Russian artillery shell detonated feet away from the bridge. Officers surrounding him collapsed in pools of blood. As the smoke cleared, terrified sailors looked up only to see Tōgō, still standing there, unmoving, virtually unscathed, calmly brushing the dust off his uniform and continuing to peer through his binoculars. That miracle led the Japanese sailors to believe their admiral was an immortal demigod, pushing their combat morale to stratospheric heights. And then, at 1355, Tōgō ordered the hoisting of the Z flag and executed the most dangerous, flawless mechanical maneuver in naval history: crossing the T. Allow me to explain the sheer brutality of this tactic. The Russian fleet was advancing in a vertical column, like the vertical stem of a T. This meant that, physics-wise, they could only utilize their forward-facing bow turrets to fire. If the ships trailing behind opened fire, they would simply blast the sterns of their own comrades ahead of them. Exploiting his superior speed, Tōgō surged his fleet ahead, then executed an act of sheer madness. He ordered the entire fleet to make a churning, violent U-turn directly across the bows of the Russian armada at one exact coordinate. The cost of this turning maneuver was incredibly daunting. For 15 agonizing minutes, each Japanese ship reaching the turning point became a stationary target. The Russian gunners only needed to aim at that single choke point to tear each vessel to shreds. Tōgō had bet the lives of his entire fleet on the incompetence of Russian gunnery. And he won. Once the last Japanese ship completed the turn, the fatal T was officially capped. This lethal turn formed a horizontal steel wall, capping the Russian advance. Why was this fatal? Because in this broadside position, the Japanese ships could rotate all their main turrets, aiming them squarely at the leading Russian formation. One side could only use weak bow guns. The other brought the combined broadside firepower of an entire fleet to bear on a single focal point. A profoundly asymmetrical web of fire had descended. Dozens of Japanese 12-inch guns roared. The air was ripped apart by shock waves. But the true instrument of destruction wasn't merely the tactical formation. It was a terrifying Japanese chemical secret: Shimo's explosive. Russian shells hitting Japanese ships frequently proved to be duds due to poor storage. But the Japanese Shimo's shells were hypersensitive. They didn't need to pierce steel armor. Simply brushing against anything on a Russian ship, wire riggings, railings, masts, would instantly trigger a detonation, creating clouds of sickly yellow toxic gas. The horrendous heat and blast waves shattered the upper structures, incinerated the wooden decks, and transformed the Russian vessels into floating crematoriums. Russian sailors didn't die from shrapnel. They were roasted alive. In a mere 45 minutes, the colossal Russian battleship Ozlyabya capsized, dragging hundreds of screaming stokers trapped in the dark compartments straight to the ocean floor. The Russian formation shattered completely, ships ramming into each other amidst the blinding smoke. Admiral Rozhestvensky took a shell fragment to the skull and fell into a coma. The pride of the Russian Empire died at that exact second. As night fell, darkness cloaked the strait. Tōgō withdrew his capital ships and unleashed his wolf pack, dozens of small torpedo boats and destroyers. Under the pitch-black cover, they hunted, weaving through the blinding barrage of Russian fire. Torpedoes tore through the water, delivering deafening, crippling blows beneath the hulls, executing the burning, agonizing steel beasts of Russia. On the morning of May 28th, the once proud Baltic Fleet had been reduced to a handful of battered, tattered vessels, surrounded on all sides by dozens of untouched Japanese 12-inch muzzles. Russian Rear Admiral Admiral Nebogatov, who had reluctantly assumed command, looked upon his blood-soaked men in the pulverized machinery. Defying the Tsar's standing order to fight to the death to preserve honor, he ordered the white flag to be raised, saving the lives of over 2,000 sailors. Yet, amidst that veil of humiliation, a radiant flame of defiant courage still burned. Listen closely, viewers, to the tale of the decrepit cruiser named Dmitrii Donskoi. This was an archaic, cumbersome armored vessel, built 2 decades prior. On the afternoon of the 28th, long after the rest of the fleet had surrendered, the Donskoi doggedly sought an escape route, only to be intercepted by 6 modern Japanese cruisers. The Japanese demanded surrender. The Russian captain, Ivan Lebedev, delivered his response. He ordered his guns loaded and fired his entire broadside directly at all 6 Japanese ships. Surrounded and having its deck shredded by incoming fire, the Donskoi fought with ferocious, stubborn desperation for hours. Captain Lebedev was mortally wounded, his blood staining the bridge, yet he used his fading strength to limp his blazing machine toward the shore of a small island. He safely evacuated his entire 600-man crew. The next morning, rather than let the Japanese flag fly atop their mast, the Russian sailors scuttled the Donskoi in deep waters. It was a brutal testament to the world. Machines may shatter, empires may crumble, but the spirit of a true Russian sailor never surrenders. It took exactly 2 rotations of the sun for a mighty European power to be utterly wiped off the seas by an Asian nation. The Russian Empire lost 21 armored warships, left 4,300 men at the bottom of the ocean, and saw nearly 6,000 taken prisoner. This battle plunged the Russian Empire into abysmal economic and political decline, directly lighting the fuse for the subsequent Russian revolutions. Japan ascended to become the dominant imperial power in Asia. Looking back at this historically bloody naval clash, I draw a ruthless philosophy regarding the era of mechanized warfare. Fervent patriotism, piety, or arrogant edicts from royalty can never halt the armor-piercing penetration of an artillery shell. Physical machinery does not lie. Admiral Tōgō won gloriously because he treated his fleet as a precise instrument of mathematics, physics, and rigorous maintenance discipline. The Russian fleet failed not because its soldiers were cowards, but because the ruling elite forced wretched mechanics to operate a mechanical scrapyard fueled by blind faith. Those stokers, toiling at 60 degrees Celsius for 8 grueling months, were the true heroes of human endurance. And here is the most agonizing question I have for you, a question exploring the razor-thin boundary between atrocity and humanity. If you were Rear Admiral Nebogatov on the morning of May 28th, facing absolute encirclement by Japanese guns, would you choose to hoist the white flag to spare the lives of 2,000 innocent men? Knowing full well, and historical fact proves this, that upon returning to Russia, he was court-martialed by the Tsar and sentenced to death for treason, though later pardoned due to public pressure? Or would you choose the path of the valiant Captain Lebedev, adamantly ordering your men to fire until the bitter end, burying yourself and your entire crew beneath the freezing ocean to protect the so-called honor of the Empire? Moral choices on the precipice of life and death are never simple equations. Leave your tactical and humanitarian perspectives down in the comments below. Thank you all for joining me on this suffocating, gunpowder-scented voyage. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe to Time Capsule, and turn on the notification bell so we can continue dissecting rusted machines and historical tragedies in the next video. Until next time, keep your gears oiled and your turrets fully loaded.